London in 1570. A complete historical documentary. Chapter 1. The Tudor Capital under Gloriana. The year was 1570. Elizabeth Tudor, daughter of the infamous Henry VIII, had occupied the throne of England for 12 years, and her capital city of London was entering what would become known as one of the most remarkable ages in English history. With a population approaching 120,000 souls, London stood as the undisputed heart of the Tudor realm, a medieval city awakening to the possibilities of the Renaissance while still bearing the marks of centuries past. To understand London in 1570 is to step into a world of profound transformation, religious upheaval, and cultural flowering that would shape the destiny of the English-speaking world. Queen Elizabeth I, now 36 years of age, had stabilized a kingdom torn apart by religious conflict under her predecessors. Her father had broken with Rome and dissolved the monasteries. Her brother Edward had pushed England toward radical Protestantism. Her sister Mary had attempted to drag the nation back to Catholicism, burning hundreds of Protestants in the process. Elizabeth had chosen a middle path, establishing a Church of England that was Protestant in doctrine, but retained many Catholic forms. This religious settlement shaped every aspect of London life in 1570. The city itself occupied a space remarkably compact by modern standards. The ancient Roman and medieval walls still defined its boundaries, enclosing an area of roughly 1 square mile. Within these walls, London proper contained over 100 parish churches, thousands of houses and shops, and a population density that would seem claustrophobic to modern inhabitants. Beyond the walls, suburbs were growing rapidly, spreading along the roads leading out of the city and across the river in Southwark. The River Thames served as London's great highway, its brown waters carrying traffic that would seem almost unimaginable today. Hundreds of wherries and boats crossed and traveled along the river constantly, transporting passengers, goods, and materials. The watermen who operated these vessels formed one of the largest occupational groups in the city, their calls and shouts echoing across the water as they competed for customers. To travel by water was often faster and more pleasant than navigating the crowded, filthy streets above. London Bridge, the only fixed crossing over the Thames, stood as one of the wonders of the age. This remarkable structure, dating back centuries, carried not just a roadway, but an entire neighborhood upon its span. Houses, shops, and even a chapel crowded the bridge, creating a tunnel-like passage that visitors found both fascinating and terrifying. At the southern end, the severed heads of traitors were displayed on pikes, a grim warning to those who had challenged the crown. The Tower of London dominated the eastern approach to the city, its ancient white keep rising above newer walls and towers that had accumulated over centuries. This fortress served multiple purposes in 1570. It housed the royal mint, stored the crown jewels, and most notoriously, imprisoned those who had fallen afoul of royal displeasure. The rack and other instruments of torture waited within its walls for those unfortunate enough to require persuasion to confess their crimes. The old Gothic Cathedral of St. Paul dominated the skyline of the city proper. This massive medieval structure, with its great spire reaching toward the heavens, served as far more than a place of worship. The central nave, known as Paul's Walk, functioned as a public meeting place where men conducted business, exchanged gossip, and sought employment. The churchyard around St. Paul's had become the center of London's flourishing book trade, with printers and booksellers clustered in the shadows of the great church. Westminster, 2 miles upriver from the City of London, housed the royal court and the institutions of national government. The Palace of Whitehall, a sprawling complex that Elizabeth had inherited from her father, served as the principal royal residence. Nearby stood Westminster Abbey, where English monarchs were crowned and buried, and Westminster Hall, where the great law courts sat in judgment. The road between Westminster and the city, known as the Strand, was lined with the great houses of the nobility. Chapter 2. The People of Tudor London. The population of London in 1570 represented a cross-section of Tudor English society, from the greatest nobles who maintained houses in the capital to the poorest beggars who scraped survival from the streets. This was a society rigidly hierarchical in theory, but surprisingly fluid in practice, where fortunes could be made and lost, and where the social mobility was greater than in almost any previous era. At the apex of London, society stood the Queen herself, surrounded by her court of nobles, gentlemen, and ladies who vied for royal favor and the rewards it could bring. These great families, the Cecils, the Dudleys, the Howards, and others, wielded enormous power and influence. Their London houses were centers of political intrigue, cultural patronage, and social display. To be seen at court, to catch the Queen's eye, to receive a royal appointment or grant could make a family's fortune for generations. The merchant class of London represented the economic backbone of the city and increasingly of the nation. These men, organized into powerful livery companies like the mercers, the grocers, and the drapers, controlled the commerce that made London wealthy. The most successful merchants rivaled the nobility in wealth, if not in social standing, and their daughters married into aristocratic families while their sons might be knighted for service to the crown. The Lord Mayor of London, always a member of one of the great livery companies, wielded authority within the city walls that even the Queen respected. The Royal Exchange, built by Sir Thomas Gresham and nearing completion in 1570, symbolized the rising importance of London's merchant community. This great building, modeled on the Bourse of Antwerp, provided a covered space where merchants could meet to conduct business regardless of weather. Its galleries would soon house shops selling luxury goods from around the world. The exchange represented England's ambition to become a major player in international commerce. Craftsmen and artisans formed the productive heart of London's economy, organized into guilds that regulated their trades. These workers produced everything from shoes and clothing to jewelry and weapons. The guild system controlled who could practice each trade, set standards for quality, and provided welfare for members who fell upon hard times. Apprentices bound themselves to masters for terms of 7 years, learning not just skills, but also the mysteries and traditions of their crafts. Women in Tudor London occupied positions defined by their marital status and social class. Married women were legally subsumed under their husbands' identities, holding no independent legal existence. Yet in practice, women played vital roles in the economy, working alongside their husbands in shops and trades, managing households, and sometimes continuing businesses after their husbands' deaths. Single women and widows had greater legal independence, but faced significant economic challenges in a world that expected women to be under male protection. Servants formed a substantial portion of the London population. Every household of any pretension employed servants, from the great noble establishments with dozens of staff to modest shopkeeping families with a single maid. Service offered young people from the countryside an entry into urban life and the possibility of saving enough to establish themselves independently. The relationship between master and servant was intimate and often exploitative, with servants living in close quarters with their employers and subject to their discipline. The poor of London were numerous and visible. Beggars crowded the streets and church steps, seeking alms from passers-by. The deserving poor, those unable to work through age, illness, or disability, received charity from parish organizations and private benefactors. The undeserving poor, those deemed capable of work but unwilling to perform it, faced harsh punishment including whipping and imprisonment. The line between poverty and crime was thin, and many of the desperate turned to theft, prostitution, or other illegal activities to survive. Foreigners added to London's diversity. Merchants from Italy, Germany, the Low Countries, and beyond maintained establishments in the city. French and Flemish Protestant refugees, fleeing religious persecution on the continent, brought skills in weaving and other crafts. These strangers, as they were called, faced periodic hostility from native Londoners, who resented their competition, but their contributions to the economy were undeniable. Chapter 3: Streets, Structures, and the Tudor Cityscape. The physical appearance of London in 1570 would strike a modern observer as overwhelmingly medieval. Narrow, crooked streets wound between timber-framed buildings that leaned toward one another, their upper stories projecting over the roadways below until they nearly touched across the narrowest lanes. Light struggled to penetrate these urban canyons, and fresh air was a precious commodity in streets choked with the refuse of daily life. The streets themselves were unpaved in most areas, turning to mud in wet weather and dust in dry. Cobblestones covered only the most important thoroughfares, and even these were poorly maintained. A channel running down the center of each street, called the kennel, carried away rainwater and whatever refuse residents threw into it. The smell of Tudor London, a mixture of human and animal waste, rotting garbage, smoke, and the various malodorous trades practiced within its walls, would overwhelm modern sensibilities. Tudor domestic architecture reflected both tradition and the growing prosperity of the age. The typical London house was built of timber, with a frame of oak filled in with wattle and daub or brick. These buildings rose 3, 4, or even 5 stories, with each upper floor projecting slightly beyond the one below in a style called jettying. The ground floor typically housed a shop or workshop open to the street, while the family lived in chambers above. The great houses of the nobility and wealthy merchants presented grander facades to the world. These structures might be built of brick or stone, surrounding courtyards and gardens that provided relief from the crowded streets. Great halls served for dining and entertainment, while private chambers offered luxury unknown to ordinary Londoners. Glass windows, still expensive and prestigious, marked the homes of the wealthy, while poorer houses made do with oiled paper or wooden shutters. Churches dominated the streetscape of Tudor London. Over 100 parish churches served the spiritual needs of the population, their towers and spires rising above the surrounding houses. These buildings ranged from modest structures squeezed between houses to substantial churches that could seat hundreds. Since the Reformation, their interiors had been stripped of the images and ornaments of Catholicism, leaving whitewashed walls, decorated only with biblical texts and the royal arms. The great monastic establishments that had once occupied substantial portions of London had been dissolved under Henry VIII, their buildings converted to other uses or demolished for building materials. The site of the Great Blackfriars Monastery had become a fashionable residential district. The charter house had been converted into a private mansion. Other former religious properties housed the poor, stored goods, or simply crumbled into ruin. Ghostly reminders of the religious revolution that had transformed England. Markets served as the commercial centers of Tudor London. Cheapside, the broad thoroughfare running through the heart of the city, hosted the most important market. Here vendors sold everything from food to fabric, their stalls and carts creating a chaos of commerce that blocked traffic and generated constant complaints. Smithfield, outside the walls, served as the great market for livestock, where cattle and sheep driven from the countryside were bought and sold. The water supply of London came from the Thames, from wells, and from public conduits that brought water from springs in the surrounding countryside. The quality was often poor, particularly for those who drew water from the increasingly polluted river. The wealthy could afford to have water carried to their houses by porters, while the poor drank whatever they could obtain and suffered the consequences. Sanitation was primitive even by the standards of the age. Cesspits beneath houses collected human waste, which was periodically emptied by rakers and carried outside the city walls. Public latrines served those without private facilities, while many simply used the streets, the river, or any convenient corner. The connection between filth and disease was dimly understood, and periodic outbreaks of plague reminded Londoners of the mortal dangers lurking in their unsanitary environment. Chapter 4: Commerce, Trade, and the Rising Economy. London in 1570 served as the economic heart of Tudor England, channeling the commerce of the nation through its port, its markets, and its counting houses. The wealth that flowed through the city enriched merchants, funded royal ambitions, and was beginning to transform England from a backwater kingdom into a significant European power. The Port of London handled the overwhelming majority of English foreign trade. Ships from across Europe, and increasingly from more distant shores, crowded the river, loading and unloading cargoes at the numerous wharves and quays that lined the Thames. Wool, England's traditional export, remained important, but cloth manufactured in English workshops was becoming an increasingly significant source of export earnings. Imports included wine from France and Spain, spices from the East, and manufactured goods that English craftsmen could not yet produce. The great trading companies organized and regulated this commerce. The merchant adventurers controlled the export of cloth to the Low Countries and Germany. The Muscovy Company traded with Russia, sending ships on perilous northern voyages to exchange English goods for furs and other Russian products. The newly formed Spanish Company sought to develop trade with the Iberian Peninsula, despite the religious tensions that were beginning to strain relations between Protestant England and Catholic Spain. Retail trade flourished in the shops and markets of London. The livery companies controlled who could sell what goods in the city, but within these constraints, commerce was vibrant and competitive. Goldsmiths' Row on Cheapside displayed the work of London's finest craftsmen in precious metals. The drapers and mercers offered fabrics domestic and imported. Apothecaries sold medicines and drugs, some helpful and some deadly, to customers seeking cures for every ailment. Banking and finance were developing rapidly, though not yet in the modern institutional forms they would later take. London goldsmiths accepted deposits and made loans, using their expertise in precious metals as the basis for financial services. Bills of exchange facilitated international commerce by allowing merchants to transfer funds across borders without physically shipping coins. The Royal Exchange provided a meeting place where merchants could make deals and arrange credit. The crafts and manufactures of London employed thousands of workers, leather workers, tailors, shoemakers, and countless other artisans produced goods for local consumption and export. The silk weavers, many of them Protestant refugees from the continent, were establishing an industry that would eventually rival that of France and Italy. Brewing, one of London's largest industries, produced the beer and ale that Londoners consumed in enormous quantities. The livery companies wielded enormous economic power. These organizations, descended from medieval guilds, controlled entry into each trade through the apprenticeship system. They set standards for quality, regulated prices, and provided welfare for their members. The 12 great livery companies, including the mercers, grocers, drapers, and goldsmiths, dominated city politics, with the Lord Mayor chosen from among their members. Wealth was displayed conspicuously in Tudor London. The rich wore elaborate clothing, maintained great houses, and employed numerous servants. Sumptuary laws attempted to restrict certain fabrics and styles to particular social ranks, but these regulations were widely ignored by those with money to spend. The possession and display of luxury goods marked one's place in society and announced one's success to the world. Poverty coexisted with wealth in intimate proximity. The same streets that housed wealthy merchants also sheltered the desperately poor. The gap between rich and poor was enormous and visible daily, as beggars sought alms from those whose clothing cost more than a laborer might earn in years. This inequality was accepted as the natural order of things. The religious obligation demanded that the wealthy provide charity to the less fortunate. Chapter 5: Daily Life and Tudor Customs. Life in 1570, London followed rhythms dictated by the sun, the seasons, and the demands of commerce and worship. Without artificial lighting beyond candles and rushlights, the day began at dawn and ended at dusk for most inhabitants. The hours between were filled with work, worship, and what pleasures could be found in this bustling, dangerous, exciting city. The day began early for working Londoners. Shops opened at 6 or 7 in the morning, and apprentices and servants rose earlier still to prepare for the day's business. Breakfast, if eaten at all, was a simple meal of bread and ale consumed quickly before work began. The main meal of the day, dinner, came around noon, when workshops paused and families gathered to eat. Supper in the evening was lighter, and early bedtimes were common for those who had to rise with the sun. Food in Tudor London varied enormously by social class. The wealthy enjoyed elaborate meals featuring multiple courses of meat, fish, and fowl, accompanied by bread, cheese, and whatever vegetables were in season. Exotic spices from the East flavored dishes for those who could afford them, and wine from France and Spain accompanied meals in prosperous households. The poor subsisted on bread, pottage, and whatever cheap protein they could obtain, with meat a rare luxury for many. Drink was essential to Tudor life, consumed at every meal and throughout the day. Water was often unsafe, particularly from the polluted Thames, so beer and ale served as the primary beverages for most Londoners. Even children drank small beer, a weak brew that quenched thirst without causing intoxication. The wealthy enjoyed wine, while spirits were used primarily for medicinal purposes. Clothing marked social status unmistakably. The wealthy wore elaborate garments of silk, velvet, and fine wool, decorated with embroidery, lace, and jewels. Ruffs, the elaborate pleated collars that characterized Elizabethan fashion, required hours of careful starching and setting. Men wore doublets and hose, while women wore bodices and full skirts over numerous undergarments. The poor made do with simple garments of coarse wool or linen, often second-hand and patched. Entertainment took many forms in Tudor London. Bear baiting and bull baiting drew crowds to arenas where fierce dogs attacked chained animals for the amusement of spectators. Public executions, including hangings, burnings, and beheadings, attracted large audiences who treated these events as entertainment. Simpler pleasures included bowling, archery, and various ball games that were popular among all social classes. The theater was beginning to emerge as a significant entertainment form in 1570, though the great playhouses that would make Elizabethan drama famous had not yet been built. Companies of actors performed in the courtyards of inns, in the halls of great houses, and in makeshift venues throughout the city. Young William Shakespeare, just 6 years old in 1570, was growing up in Stratford, unaware of the theatrical career that would make his name immortal. Religion permeated daily life. Church attendance on Sunday was legally required, and the parish church served as the center of community life. Baptisms, marriages, and burials all took place within the church, and the church bells marked the hours of the day. The religious settlement imposed by Elizabeth required outward conformity to the Church of England, but private belief remained a matter of individual conscience for many. The calendar of the year was marked by religious holidays and seasonal festivals. Christmas brought a period of feasting and celebration that extended to Twelfth Night. Easter was preceded by the solemnity of Lent, when meat was forbidden and fasting required. Various saints' days, retained despite the Reformation, provided occasions for celebration and time off from work. Disease was an ever-present threat. Plague, the most feared killer, struck London repeatedly, carrying off thousands in bad years, and forcing those who could afford to do so to flee to the countryside. Smallpox, typhus, and countless other diseases took their toll on a population that had no understanding of how diseases spread or how to prevent them. Medicine offered little help, with treatments based on theories of bodily humors that often did more harm than good. Chapter 6: Governance, Religion, and the Shadows of the Age. London in 1570 existed under a system of governance that combined ancient civic traditions with royal authority and religious establishment. The Queen's government, operating from Westminster, set the direction of national policy, while the City of London maintained cherished privileges of self-governance within its walls. Religious conformity was demanded, and those who dissented faced penalties ranging from fines to death. The year 1570 brought particular religious tension to London and all of England. In February, Pope Pius V had issued the papal bull Regnans in Excelsis, which excommunicated Queen Elizabeth and declared her a heretic. This document released English Catholics from their allegiance to the Queen and effectively made up practicing Catholicism an act of treason. The bull transformed the religious situation in England, placing Catholics in an impossible position between their faith and their loyalty to the crown. The Northern Rebellion of 1569 had just been suppressed with great severity. Catholic nobles in the north had risen in support of Mary Queen of Scots, whom they hoped to place on the English throne. The rebellion had been crushed, and hundreds had been executed in retaliation. The fear of Catholic conspiracy, already present in Protestant England, intensified dramatically, and suspicion fell upon anyone whose religious conformity seemed doubtful. The Tower of London housed numerous prisoners whose religious or political offenses had placed them in disfavor. The rack and other instruments of torture were employed to extract confessions from those suspected of treason or conspiracy. The interrogators who worked within the tower's walls were skilled at their grim trade, and few could resist their methods indefinitely. The city government of London operated through the Court of Aldermen and the Common Council. The Lord Mayor, elected annually from among the aldermen, served as the chief magistrate of the city, presiding over courts and representing London in dealings with the Crown. The aldermen, each representing one of the city's 26 wards, formed an oligarchy of wealthy merchants who controlled city affairs. The Common Council, a larger body elected by the freemen of each ward, exercised legislative functions but wielded less real power. Law enforcement was primitive by modern standards. The constables and watchmen who maintained order were unpaid citizens serving their required terms of duty. They lacked training, equipment, and often motivation, making London's streets dangerous places after dark. Those who could afford to do so hired link boys to carry torches and provide some protection when traveling at night. The desperate and the criminal prowled the darker corners of the city, preying on the unwary. Justice was swift and often brutal. The courts that sat in Westminster Hall and various venues throughout the city handled everything from minor disputes to capital crimes. Punishments ranged from fines and public humiliation in the stocks, or pillory, to branding, mutilation, and death. Hanging was the standard penalty for felonies, while treason warranted the full horror of being hanged, drawn, and quartered. Public executions served both as punishment and as warning, demonstrating the power of the law to all who witnessed them. The threat of invasion and war hung over 1570 London. Relations with Spain were deteriorating as religious differences combined with commercial competition and English support for Dutch rebels against Spanish rule. French religious wars created instability across the Channel, while the presence of Mary Queen of Scots in English captivity provided a constant focus for Catholic plots. The army and navy were being strengthened, and Londoners knew that war might come to their shores. Despite these dangers and difficulties, London in 1570 was a city of remarkable energy and vitality. The cultural flowering that would produce Shakespeare, Marlowe, and countless other artists was beginning to stir. English explorers were venturing to new worlds, and English merchants were extending their reach across the globe. The foundations of empire were being laid, and the city that would become the capital of that empire was taking shape. The London of 1570 was a city of contradictions. Beauty and squalor existed side by side. Great wealth and desperate poverty shared the same streets. Religious devotion coexisted with brutal punishment for religious dissent. Learning and ignorance, culture and cruelty, hope and fear all mingled in this crowded, vital, dangerous place. To walk the streets of London in 1570 was to experience a world on the cusp of tremendous change. The medieval city was giving way to something new, though no one yet knew what that something would be. The age of Elizabeth was reaching its height, and the accomplishments that would make it famous were still largely in the future. Those who lived through 1570 could not know what the coming decades would bring, but they could sense that they lived in remarkable times. The legacy of 1570, London lives on in the institutions, traditions, and physical remnants that survive to this day. The Tower of London still stands, though no longer as a prison. The churches that survived the Great Fire of 1666 still serve their parishes. The street patterns laid down in medieval times still guide traffic through the city. Understanding London in 1570 helps us understand how the modern city came to be and reminds us that even the greatest cities are built upon the foundations laid by those who came before.